Welcome back! My name is ballerscuba. This is Video Games Over Time. We are still in 1979, and today we're going to talk about the honorable mentions of 1979. Let's start at Atari. As we briefly discussed in our video on Adventure, Atari, under the management of Ray Kasser and Warner Communications, tried to protect their company by reducing the influence of their own developers. Atari no longer gave credit to its developers for the games they created. In particular, David Crane, the developer of 3 games for the Atari VCS, noticed, thanks to a memo from Ray Kasser himself, that Crane's 3 games brought in over $20 million in profit to Atari, over $70 million in 2020, while Crane received a salary of just $20,000, over $70,000 in 2020. David Crane joined with Larry Kaplan, Alan Miller, and Bob Whitehead to voice their complaints. Known as the Gang of Four, these men met with Kasser in May 1979 to demand royalties and to have their names put on the boxes. Kasser was not impressed and dismissed the men's demands. So these 4 men, who had together developed 16 of the 36 games for the Atari VCS by 1979, 44% of the console's library, left Atari to form their own company. On October 1st, 1979, thanks to a $1 million investment from Sutter Hill Ventures, over $3.5 million in 2020, Activision was formed. Despite the loss of some of the Atari VCS's best programmers, Atari had a good year in 1979. On top of Star Raiders, Asteroids, and Adventure, Atari released several other games in 1979. One game released by Atari was Superman for the Atari VCS. Designed by John Dunn, Superman was the first official video game of the then 41-year-old DC Comics superhero. Technically, the game was built based on Warren Robinette's prototype for Adventure. In the game, the player controls Superman and must stop and capture his nemesis, Lex Luthor, then change back into Clark Kent and return to the Daily Planet as quickly as possible. Superman was well received at the time, with critics praising the graphics and the game's complexity. But as time has gone on, the game's reception has gone downhill. In total, the Atari VCS saw 10 more cartridges released in 1979, bringing the total number of games available for the system to 36. During the 1979 holiday season, Atari sold over 1 million Atari VCS cartridges, despite the increase in competition. In August 1979, Atari released Lunar Lander to arcades. Designed by Howard Dellman and Rich Moore, Lunar Lander was based on earlier Lunar Lander games that had existed since 1969. This iteration of Lunar Lander used vector graphics to display a spaceship that the player must guide to a safe landing on the moon's surface. Lunar Lander was fairly successful, selling 4,830 cabinets to become the most popular version of Lunar Lander to date. Let's turn to TSR and Dungeons & Dragons. TSR published the Dungeon Masters Guide in 1979, written by Gary Gygax. The Dungeon Masters Guide covered the essential rules for Dungeon Masters, as referees were now called. These rules helped Dungeon Masters assist in player character creation, and instructed Dungeon Masters on how to manage non-player characters, combat, adventures, and multi-session campaigns. The book includes descriptions of treasure, items, random monster encounters, and monster statistics, as well as tables and charts to help figure out damage and resolve encounters, create characters, and show the different class abilities. The guide also featured a random dungeon generator. By rolling dice, the Dungeon Master could generate a dungeon complete with passageways, rooms, treasure, monsters, and other encounters as the game was played. TSR also released a supplement in the form of the Dungeon Masters screen. These boards would create a partition between the Dungeon Master and the players, while showing the Dungeon Master frequently use tables for easy reference. With the release of the Dungeon Master's Guide, the third book for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, the release of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was complete. While TSR was profiting from this new release, Dave Arneson was not. So, in 1979, Dave Arneson sued TSR, claiming that Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was so similar to Dungeons & Dragons that Arneson should be acknowledged as co-creator, and that Arneson should receive royalties for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. This lawsuit would continue past 1979, so we will have to return to it at a later point. Let's turn to some other video games in 1979. In August 1979, Automated Simulations released Temple of Apshai. Developed by Jim Connolly, John Freeman, and Jeff Johnson, Temple of Apshai is a graphical dungeon-crawling role-playing game. Originally released for the TRS-80 and the Commodore PET, Temple of Apshai has the player create a character, then delve into a dungeon using rules largely influenced by Dungeons & Dragons. The character goes through the dungeon, killing monsters, gaining experience, and collecting treasure, with no other clear-cut goal. The game proved to be successful, becoming the most successful role-playing game for years. By 1982, Temple of Apshai had sold over 30,000 copies. In November 1979, Taito released the sequel to Space Invaders, Space Invaders Part 2, designed by Tomohiro Nishikado. This arcade game saw a few improvements to the original Space Invaders, including colors on the aliens, aliens that split into smaller aliens when shot, new UFOs, including UFOs that will deploy additional aliens, small scenes between stages, and adding stage numbers to the shields on the screen. The game could not match the success of the original Space Invaders, despite being released in North America, where Midway Games retitled it as Space Invaders Deluxe. In 1979, Richard Garriott released Akalabeth World of Doom. Richard Garriott had just graduated high school when he developed Akalabeth over the summer for Apple II computers using AppleSoft BASIC. Inspired by Dungeons & Dragons, as well as The Lord of the Rings, Akalabeth is a role-playing game named after the Akalabeth section of the Silmarillion. In the game, the player receives quests from Lord British, Richard Garriott's nickname, to defeat 10 difficult monsters. The game uses a top-down overhead view for the world, but a first-person view for the dungeons. Akalabeth was released first by Richard Garriott himself in 1979, before being published by California Pacific Computer Company in 1980. The game sold around 30,000 units, providing Richard Garriott with a new career just out of high school. Let's turn to hardware. Nintendo continued developing their Color TV game series in 1979 by releasing the Color TV game Block Kuzushi on April 23, 1979. The console played 6 variations of Breakout. This console did not do as well as the others in the series. In November 1979, Milton Bradley released the Microvision. The Microvision is the first handheld game console to use ROM cartridges. It was powered by 2 9-volt batteries that charged the console. The console itself did not have a CPU on board. The console only held the controls and the LCD to play the games. Instead, the game cartridges would each have their own CPU, primarily the Intel 8021 and the Texas Instruments TMS 1100 microchips. The Microvision launched with 4 games, followed by 3 more games in 1979. The console had moderate success when it was originally released. The Magnavox Odyssey 2 was officially released in North America in February 1979. 6 more games were released for the Odyssey 2 in 1979, bringing the total number of games to 17. Meanwhile, the Bally Astrocade only saw 1 more game released in 1979, bringing its total to 13. Still holding on to relevance, 21 new first-generation consoles were released in 1979, mostly in Europe. By this point, it was clear that the first-generation consoles were on the way out, but companies were still looking to turn a profit on dedicated consoles. The Microvision was the only second-generation console to be released in 1979. In June 1979, Apple released the Apple II Plus, the second computer in their Apple II line. The Apple II Plus featured AppleSoft BASIC written into the machine, and the capability to expand to 64 kilobytes of RAM, among other small improvements. The Apple II Plus sold for $1,195, over $4,200 in 2020. $100 cheaper than the Apple II sold for 2 years earlier. The Apple II Plus was popular, much like the original Apple II. Over the next 4 years, Apple sold around 380,000 Apple II Pluses. In September 1979, the Nippon Electric Company, NEC, a Japanese electronics company, released the PC-8001 in Japan, selling for 168,000 yen, around $760 in 1979, over $2,600 in 2020. The PC-8001 home computer used the powerful NEC MU-PD780C processor, capable of speeds of 4 MHz, had 16 or 32 kilobytes of RAM, and ran the NBASIC interpreter. The computer system proved very successful in Japan, selling around 250,000 units. Due to this success, work began on converting the system to international markets. And that is the video game industry in 1979. And that is going to do it for 1979. My name is ballerscuba. This has been Video Games Over Time. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in our next video where we'll look back over the progress so far.